for the victim. So a little bit about victim witness advocacy. The offices are, there's an office in each of the counties in the state of New Jersey. We work with the prosecutor's offices. And in most counties across the country, there are victim witness offices as well. We're funded through a federal grant. I work under my director, Sharon May, who's here. Grateful to her for running an amazing unit. I may be a little biased, but I think we're one of the best in the state. Definitely one of the biggest, and we've never had our funding cut. We've only grown, which is a huge feat for a victim witness unit in the state of New Jersey. So thank you, Sharon, for all of that.
You're welcome.
I do a few things with domestic violence. We work primarily with the criminal cases through the prosecutor's office, being a point of contact to help guide the victim through what can be a really murky system. I can be the first point of contact after law enforcement. Usually they get a letter from our office, and that's the first time they're hearing from anyone after reporting the incident. I know as growing up, we're all taught as little kids to dial 911 or to call the police, but we're not really walked through the process of what happens after that. You know, what do we do once the police are called? And that's where victim witness comes in. We can help you figure out what is a trial going to look like? What does this charge mean? Do you need a counselor? Can we put you in touch with a counselor as well? So that's most of what we do on the criminal side of things. We also work with the civil sometimes, because mostly with the restraining orders. So what we'll do is we'll go with the victim. Oftentimes they feel very, very much alone in the system, and part of my job is to let them know that they're not alone, that there are hundreds, if not thousands of these cases a year. We see it all the time, and there is hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There can be. Even if it's not the first time, they're there. If it's the third or fourth time they've come back, they're filing for another restraining order, and they feel like sometimes law enforcement makes them feel like they're not going to be able to, you know, get the justice they deserve because it's the third or fourth time they've been through the system. But it's my job and our office's job to let them know what their rights are as victims, and that it doesn't matter how many times they come back, they still have a right to file for another restraining order and to put their safety first again. You know, like you heard in the beginning, I don't know if some of the classes weren't here, but it is a cycle of violence. That's often what people who have studied domestic violence have seen, and it's our job to educate, be the first point of education for these victims before they go on to group therapy with the local domestic violence agency or individual therapy, or go through the case, that it is a cycle often. You know, you have this walking on eggshells part where you know, there's tension building is what it's called, and then there's this big incident, and you know, it can be a slap, it can be destroying furniture, it can be punching a hole through the wall, and then there's the apology phase, there's the honeymoon phase, what they call it. You know, bring you flowers, apologize, I'm so sorry, I love you, I'll never do it again. I do presentations with high schools as well about dating violence, and one thing I always bring up is the Rihanna and Chris Brown situation, and that the Eminem song as well that Rihanna does with Eminem, Love the Way You Lie, and the whole idea of, you know, he says these things, but he doesn't follow through on them. Yeah, sure, I love you, I'll never do it again. That's often not what happens. A funny point, actually, when I talk to high schools about this, I hear often from the teenage girls that, well, Rihanna must have deserved it. So that, I mean, that's the mindset often that we're working with. Do you have a question?
I said, how does that even work, though? How can you actually determine who's at fault for anything kind of thing like that?
That's a good question, and oftentimes it's difficult for law enforcement when they first arrive on a scene to determine that. I don't know if Debbie wants to address that at all later, but I know that when they arrive at the scene, sometimes they'll go with who has the injuries. So, you know, if maybe the female, it's a male-female relationship. Of course, domestic violence can happen in all relationships. And the female was defending herself and gave the guy a black eye. Sometimes the officers will arrest her, even if she's the one who called the police in the first place. So it can be tricky sometimes. Majority of the time, the law enforcement is able to figure out who the victim is, but there are some cases where it slips through, but it is usually discovered later in the process who the true victim is. So part of also what I do with the final restraining order hearings is we also talk to victims who want to drop restraining orders. And this happens a lot. And I probably, like, at least 80% of the time, the victims will come back and dismiss the restraining order maybe a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, sometimes the day after they file for the restraining order. So part of what we do is we talk to them and, again, educate them as to the fact that there is a cycle of violence, that most likely if the perpetrator gets away with it this time, statistics have shown that it escalates and it will get worse. And we don't want to necessarily scare the victims. We're there also as an emotional support to them to let them know that they're not alone and we can help them through this process. But we want them to know the reality of it as well. Most of them don't understand the bigger picture when they first walk into the office. They're overwhelmed with their own situation and what's going on with them. So we help them, give them statistics, give them a little pamphlet, a booklet about what domestic violence is, and try to give them all the information they need to make an educated decision as to whether they really should or shouldn't drop